Let's cross now to Dr. Flavio Toxvay, who's an economic epidemiologist at the University of Cambridge. Dr. Toxvay, thank you very much for joining us. You've been looking at the timing and the dates and the schedules that have been coming out from the English and for England, for the UK government and for the Scottish government too. We've just been discussing that with Professor Griffiths. Who is maybe taking the more realistic approach here, do you think?
Well, thank you first of all for having me. It's a pleasure to be on. So as your previous guest rightly pointed out, there are no substantial differences. There is maybe a difference slightly in timing where the Scottish approach seems to be slightly more cautious. I think the main difference is really one of messaging. The UK Prime Minister seems to have been pressured to give definite dates, but with the caveat that these will be changed maybe as things develop on the ground, whereas the First Minister has taken a more cautious approach and said, well, it's all up to the state of play, and then we will act accordingly. And in some senses, more than an economics decision, is more of a political decision, whether you want to disappoint people now by being more vague, but maybe over-deliver by doing it earlier, as the First Minister suggested might be the case, or whether you want to tie yourself to the mast with specific dates and then have to maybe disappoint later on if those dates turn out not to be realistic. So really, I think it's mostly a question of differences in messaging and perhaps also different responses to pressure from the opposition in the two different cases.
Yes, you don't want to be a hostage to fortune, I suppose, but what do you think is better for business and the economy? Do you think it's better not to let people down and have a regressive step, or is it better to give people hope in a sense? Which way might be better?
So I think hope is important, but I think health is even more important than hope. And so we have to recognize that the underlying problem, the underlying economic damage is caused by the disease, not by the measures themselves. And so the best way out of this economic crisis is really to get the infection under control. No business is served by having an out-of-control epidemic unless you're an undertaker. So let's just be real here. The problem is that we have an infectious disease in our hands, and that keeps people away from their workplaces. It keeps people away from restaurants and from hospitality businesses. Nobody is served, not even the business community, by having an out-of-control epidemic. So really what we need to do now is we have to shepherd the epidemic to a point where it's controllable with a different combination of measures, that is lockdown, social distancing, face masks, and now increasingly with vaccines. And once we have confidence that we actually can control the disease, then we can start easing restrictions and get back to normal life, which includes, of course, all the nice things that life has to offer, such as going to restaurants and meeting loved ones. I think is an unhelpful way to look at it as just health versus business. It's also in business's interest to have this under control.
I wonder if you've been perhaps comparing the economy of the United Kingdom to that of the United States, where I suppose it's a virus that has been left to run out of control, but a lot more economic activity has been going on. There were pictures in the newspapers of people at the opera in Florida on Sunday. Which economy might recover faster, do you think?
Well, it is true that lockdowns have created a lot of damage, which will also have long-lasting effects on the economy in the UK and elsewhere, and perhaps there's going to be more scarring. But the US has paid a very grim price for that in terms of a number of deaths across the epidemics. It's one of the worst records in the world, and so you have to ask yourself whether that's a price worth paying.
And Dr. Toxvay, just finally, what do you make of vaccination certificates? How effective might they be in helping the economy recover, or does that create an unfair system, do you think?
So these are, in some sense, two separate issues. I think there's no doubt that if we can have a credible system in place that can distinguish people in terms of vulnerability and in terms of whether they infect others, then if we could have that system in place, that could be hugely useful in order to restart the economy. Now, there's a separate set of issues that are ethical issues about equity that in some sense is a conversation that needs to be had, but it's a separate set of questions than the ones that are strictly economic, as it were.
OK, Dr. Flavio Toxvay from Cambridge University, thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. Thank you.
Pleasure.